Hello friends! Today we are going to paint birch trees together. I'll be working on A3 sized paper. Previously I painted on slightly smaller A4 paper. If you have cotton paper, I recommend using it for this masterclass because many of the techniques we'll be using require good water absorption. If you don't have cotton paper, that's okay too. My current paper is cellulose, which also absorbs water nicely. However, I found it more challenging to work on cellulose compared to cotton. The drawing for this lesson is quite simple. Start by identifying the points where the river exits the edges of your paper. It's important to determine these points first because it's tricky to estimate them by eye. Avoid beginning the river without knowing where it will exit the frame. You might accidentally lead it in the wrong direction. Once you've established these exit points, it will be much easier to shape the riverbanks, the left and right banks. Pay attention to the relief of the banks. Try to avoid repeating elements in the shapes of the banks. Instead, make them varied and dynamic. Repetitive patterns can create an undesired rhythm in the composition, which we don't want. For the birch trees, start with the largest ones, beginning with those closest to the foreground. Note that birch trees don't change much in thickness from the base to the top. The change is minimal. To make them look realistic, each tree should have its own unique curve. Some may bend slightly at different points. Feel free to experiment with this. You can follow a reference image or create the trees on your own. The reference is there to guide you, not to restrict your creativity. Use it as a helpful tool, not as a strict template. Branches should also vary. Let them cross over each other freely, even covering parts of the trunks behind them. For the largest birch tree in the foreground, there will be a branch that stretches across the entire page, acting as a connecting element in the composition. As you work your way to the background, repeat the same process. At this point, you can pause the video, open a reference photo, and take a closer look at how birch trees are drawn. Try to replicate the general structure, but again, let the reference inspire rather than constrain you. Remember that each tree is unique, with its own curve and character. Avoid straight, uniform trunks. They should have some natural bends or imperfections. This will make the trees look more realistic. Later, when we add paint, the brushwork will help emphasize these natural curves. For now, as we sketch with a pencil, we can already add some subtle irregularities to the shapes. To prepare for working on the background, we'll use masking fluid to protect the birch trunks and branches. This will allow us to confidently work wet on wet for the background without worrying about painting over the trees. Before applying the masking fluid, you can soak the brush lightly to protect it. Use an older brush you don't mind damaging. For thicker trunks, you might not need to cover the entire surface with masking fluid, just the main outlines. If you can focus well enough to avoid accidentally painting over the tree trunks with colour. Later, you might skip masking them entirely. However, it's better to cover the entire trunks with masking fluid. This way, you can fully concentrate on the background without worrying about the trees. Otherwise, you might get distracted, forget, and accidentally let the paint seep into areas where it's not needed. For example, I only outlined the base of some trunks with masking fluid, and later regretted it because I'd forgotten got colour in those areas. For the branches, try to give them a slightly irregular, crooked shape right from the pencil sketch. When you paint, keep your hand loose and avoid drawing perfectly straight lines. Instead, let the brush naturally create those subtle bends, giving the branches a more organic look. The more you practice, the easier it will become. To create snowflakes, you can use the back end of your brush, a toothpick or any fine-tipped stick. Simply dab small, uneven circles to mimic snowflakes. The size will vary depending on how the masking fluid pools. Remember, there's no point adding snowflakes where the background is already white. They'll only be visible against darker areas like the sky or river. And when placing them, don't overthink it. If you try to arrange them too systematically, you risk making them look like polka dots. Let them scatter randomly for a natural effect.
Quiet star, quiet star, quiet star.
Wait until the masking fluid is fully dry before continuing. While it dries, you can prepare your materials. If you want to add extra texture to the background, you can use salt. This step isn't mandatory, but it's an option for adding interest. The background will be painted wet on wet, so it's crucial that the masking fluid has dried completely to avoid smudging. When painting the background, branches might feel like obstacles, but make sure to paint over them smoothly with your brush strokes. Before starting, you can pre-select your colours by testing them on a spare sheet of paper to see how they'll look together. For this painting, I'm using pinkish, violet and yellow tones. Light comes from the upper right corner, so the bottom left corner of the painting will be the darkest, apart from the evergreens. Working on absorbent cotton paper makes this process much easier. Cotton distributes water evenly, whereas cellulose paper, like the Fabriano I'm using now, tends to leave paint sitting on the surface, which creates pooling. You might see marks where excess water collects. If you're uncertain about your colours, start with a test wash on a scrap sheet to get a feel for the brush and how the colours blend. When applying colour to the wet background, avoid broad strokes. Instead, use the tip of the brush to nudge and spread the paint gently. This technique allows you to achieve smooth transitions and avoid harsh lines. Remove any excess puddles to prevent unwanted streaks or uneven drying. Once the background is done, you'll see how beautifully it complements the birch trees. Once again about the birch trees. They may act as barriers, potentially creating a separation of colours. For example, one side might have a bright pink area, while on the other side of the birch there could be a yellow area. I noticed this in my painting as well. There's a yellow patch bordered distinctly by a pink patch to its left. This isn't ideal, so try to avoid such sharp separations. For the evergreen trees, you'll need a beautiful green. By beautiful, I mean a green that isn't used straight from the pan. For this painting, I used emerald green, which is vivid and saturated. I mixed it with brown and added a bit of indanthrone blue. Avoid using pure light green for the evergreens. They need to be dark and deep, but still fluid and diluted with water, not thick or overly bright. Achieving depth in colour. Use richly pigmented colours like emerald green and possibly even add a touch of violet. Experiment with mixtures on a test sheet. There are many options. You can also use dark green, which despite its darkness has an easily diluted pigment that lightens mixtures nicely. If you make a mistake or apply too much paint while working wet on wet, don't hesitate to blot it with a paper towel or lift it with a damp brush. You can sprinkle salt for an interesting texture effect. Once the background dries, move to the river. Start by removing excess water from the background to avoid unattractive streaks. For the lower edge of the painting, Use a brush to create an uneven boundary while tilting the paper upward so the water flows away from you. At this point, you can also lift out tree shapes on the distant background using a flat synthetic brush. This technique works best if the brush is blotted dry on a paper towel. To soften the edges of colours, use a clean wet brush along the boundary, tilting the paper so the paint flows upward, avoiding the lower edge where excess water might collect. For the river, use a colour similar to the evergreens, dark and cool. If you don't have indanthrene blue, you can mix dark blue with a touch of brown or ochre. Avoid using indanthrene blue in its pure form, as it may appear too vibrant. If you're incorporating violet or blue tones, be mindful of their intensity. Both have strong pigments and should be muted with brown to avoid an overly bright, unnatural river. Our goal is a cold, wintry tone for the water. Use a darker shade of blue, but make sure it's muted with ochre. This will help tone it down. When adding ochre, try to avoid fully blending it into the blue. Instead, let it remain as distinct strokes or patches. These small variations might not be very noticeable, but when they are, they'll add the right texture in the right places. If you find it difficult to create an even wash on dry paper, especially if your paper absorbs water quickly, you can wet the entire river area first and then introduce the colour. This will allow the paint to spread smoothly. For the river, aim for an even wash without streaks. If streaks do occur, make sure they are horizontal, moving across the river in the direction of the flow. When introducing ochre into the blue, keep the strokes horizontal. Even if the strokes aren't clearly visible, the overall patches should align horizontally. This approach will give the river a natural look. Use plenty of water for this technique. A large brush is recommended to help you cover the river area evenly without accidentally painting over the snow. You don't need to perfectly follow the outlines of the riverbanks. If the brush goes slightly outside the lines, it will add charm and character with those subtle imperfections. I'm also using an additional colour here, which I'll explain in more detail in a later theoretical lesson. It's easy to create a multicoloured wash for the river, but make sure water doesn't pool in any areas, as this can cause unwanted streaks when drying. There is a birch tree reflected in the river. I forgot about this detail during my first attempt, but you can refer to the reference image to include it in your painting. For the snow, unlike the dark, muted colours of the river, the snow should be clean and bright, with transparent blue and violet shadows. These shadows can range in hue from pinkish tones to light blues, offering a beautiful spectrum of colours. The key is to keep the shadows transparent and light, using plenty of water to dilute the paint. You can vary the shadows within a single area, letting cooler blue tones blend softly into warmer pink tones. Remember that the light source comes from the right, so all shadows will fall to the left of the objects creating them. There are two types of shadows in the snow. 1. Shadows from the trees. These have sharper edges and are darkest closest to the tree trunk. The farther away from the object, the lighter and softer the shadow becomes. 2. Shadows from the snow's texture. These shadows are softer and more diffused, with blurred edges. They are lighter and less defined than tree shadows, but still contribute to the overall depth and realism of the snow. Even tree shadows, while sharper, are not perfectly straight because they follow the uneven surface of the snow. Instead, they appear slightly wavy, Keep in mind the principles of atmospheric perspective. Objects and shadows in the background should appear lighter and softer to create a sense of distance. Pay attention to the direction of light and shadows, ensuring they enhance the depth and realism of the scene. The most intense shadow colours should appear closer to the foreground. As they recede into the distance, shadows gradually become lighter. If you can capture this effect, it will enhance the depth of your painting. The background colour may be influenced by a sunset-like effect, but it also ties into the snow's colours in the reference image. In some areas you can see pinkish tones that complement the background. These shades can be incorporated into your painting for harmony and a cohesive look. Now, on the far side of the river, I'm painting the snow shadows. These shadows have soft, diffused edges, unlike the sharper edges of tree shadows. I blur all these boundaries to make them light and gentle. For the tree shadows, I leave the edges crisp and sharp. The same process is repeated on the distant shore, but here the direction of the shadows may be less clear, as they seem to fall from our right bank onto the left. Thank you for watching my tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment. This helps my channel grow and motivates me to create more engaging content for you. If you'd like to support the channel financially, check the description for ways to do so. You can also subscribe to my Patreon account for exclusive lessons not available on YouTube. Follow me on Telegram and Instagram for more inspiration and useful content. Thank you again for watching, and let's continue painting. If water collects and forms puddles, blot it up immediately to avoid unwanted marks when the paint dries. For example, I had some paint flow into the snow area, but I left it as if it was a small snowbank. For shadows, it's better to work wet on wet for smoother results, but you can also lift paint on dry paper if needed. One specific example is the large birch tree on the left bank. You can create a subtle shadow by lifting paint horizontally with a clean brush. Be mindful of the far corner of the river, as I forgot to paint that section initially. Don't leave it unfinished. It's an important detail. When painting shadows, don't overdo them. Ensure some areas remain white for balance. In the background, you can use a light blue tone to indicate distant trees. Keep them soft and faint to maintain depth. After the background dries completely, it's time to remove the masking fluid. I used an eraser for this, which worked well. Not all the marks on the birches need to be purely black. Some areas can feature brighter, warmer brown patches. Remember, the light source is on the right side, so the warmer tones will appear more prominently on the right, while the left side will lean towards cooler tones. On the right, you can leave a white highlight to represent the light reflecting off the birch bark. This highlight doesn't need to be perfectly smooth, because birch bark has a naturally uneven texture. Let the imperfections add to its realism. The black markings on the birches. These should also appear irregular, more like random patches than straight lines. I chose to use oxide black for this. Its granulating properties naturally create interesting textures and add depth. When diluted with water, it produces lighter tones, so you can layer it to build the intensity gradually. For the branches, you can vary the tones, darker browns in some areas, and even hints of bluish tones in others. It doesn't need to be exact. Use any of the shades you're already using for the birches. You can leave some white spaces within the branches, preferably towards the top, to give them more dimension. The first birch tree might feel the most challenging, but once you've completed it, the rest will come naturally. Use a multicoloured wash for the birch bark. A soft blue tone works well, and ultramarine is a great choice because it's warm and not overly bright. Avoid overly pigmented, vibrant blues. They'll dominate the painting. If you're using bright blue, tone it down by mixing in a hint of pink to create a lighter, more transparent effect. Add warm tones like browns to create subtle variations and let the colours blend naturally on the paper. Allow the patches and markings on the birch trees to form organically, with no specific pattern, to keep them realistic. Start with a wet-on-wet technique for the birch bark to create soft, flowing patterns. Then, for the foreground birches, you can enhance the details with a dry brush, adding sharper strokes to emphasize contrast while maintaining the watercolor's transparency. The process is very intuitive once you get into it. After completing the first tree, you can relax and enjoy the rest. If you'd like, play some soothing music in the background and simply focus on the rhythm of your brush strokes. Let the birch trees take shape naturally, each one unique. Take your time working calmly and steadily as you refine the birch trees. You can experiment with more complex colour transitions, even on thinner branches. For instance, a colour might start as brown and gradually shift into black.
Quiet star, quiet star, quiet star, quiet star.
In the background, I accidentally created a trunk that was too thick at the base. Such moments can be adjusted as you work. Pay attention to the shadows under the birch trees and how the trees connect to the snow. Avoid leaving an empty white space under the trunks, which might make them look disconnected. Add subtle shadows or soft transitions at the base of the trees to integrate them into the snowy ground. You can enhance the riverbank by adding a faint shadow where the snow meets the water. Use muted grey or soft black tones for this. Avoid making these shadows too dark. A dirty grey or diluted black works best. Focus on areas where the snow curves towards the viewer, such as the edge of a snowdrift. For example, I painted a snowdrift with one side slightly blocking the view of the waterline. You can use this technique to suggest the interaction between the snow and the water. Any small patches can be interpreted as ice, tiny islands, or sections of the bank. On the second layer of the bank, show where the snow meets the water with slight shadows or reflections. These small adjustments give the painting depth and make the scene more cohesive. That's it. Step back and review your painting. Take a photo of it to assess the composition and balance. Think about whether anything is missing or if there are areas that could use more detail or adjustment. Feel free to share your work. I'd love to see what you've created. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you in the next workshop.